everybody, and welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about resistance to rifaximin. Dun dun dun, every IBS and SIBO patient's worst nightmare. There's actually two types of resistance that we need to consider. I'm going to start with the first one that you're probably already thinking about with the title of this video. We're going to be talking about the bacteria building up resistance to rifaximin first, and then we're going to cover the other type of resistance that you could have in the latter half of this video. So let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. I pulled up some scholarly articles to get the conversation going. So first off, there's a couple of articles that I pulled up that I thought were relevant to share with regards to irritable bowel syndrome treatment. Because realistically, this is a drug that is used most commonly for treating IBS and SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It's also used sometimes for IBD and cirrhosis and apparently hepatitis, which I found out today on PubMed. So there's other applications for it, certainly, but I'm going to try to focus more so on SIBO and irritable bowel syndrome and IBD, since those are the conditions that a lot of you guys are dealing with, and that's why you are subscribers of my channel. So this is a 2016 study, Rifaximin for the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome, a drug safety evaluation. So this is only about 5, 6, 7 years old now. And if you jump down to the conclusions, they did say in here, they said rifaximin-related side effects in patients with IBS are reported to be mild and infrequent. Microbial resistance is rare and transient. And that's what we hear a lot, particularly if you listen to Dr. Pimentel's work. A lot of SIBO experts will talk about how microbial resistance to rifaximin is either non-existent or hardly heard of. It's very rare, it's very transient, and it's not a big deal. I would like to challenge that perspective at least a little bit and at least plant the idea in our minds that we don't truly know yet. And as much as I adore Dr. Pimentel and his work, and I think that he's really at the forefront of researching for IBS and SIBO, he does work for the company that makes rifaximin. So whether it's intentional or unintentional, you do need to have in mind that he's going to be a little bit biased in favor of rifaximin simply because he is employed by the company that makes it. So that being said, this is the very frequent dialogue that we hear, and we can see it here in this article. Microbial resistance is rare and transient. Then they actually mention C. diff infection, which is something that we're going to talk about. C. diff infection is not unusual it is not usual in patients receiving rifaximin in the absence of predisposing condition. So if you are blatantly immunocompromised, or if you've had a lot of other antibiotics leading up to the course of rifaximin, perhaps you could get C. diff because of it, but it's not very commonplace that people will get C. diff because of rifaximin. We're actually going to talk about that in a separate video soon. So I'm going to table that C. diff conversation just a little bit, but know that it can happen. But the kind of thought right now is that it's going to be more rare unless you have some predisposing factors. Jumping into another article, this is rifaximin for the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome. Is there a high risk for development of antimicrobial resistance? This is actually older. This is a 2013 paper. And again, if we jump down, we can see here that the conclusion of the paper was, when considering the importance of rifaximin or rifamycins in the treatment of serious human disease, the large number of patients affected by IBS, and the lack of scientific evidence available on the development of antibiotic resistance to rifaximin over the long term when used in the gut, it is advisable that the use of rifaximin as a therapy for IBS should be limited to single acute short-term treatment. Whoa, baby, that is a lot different than probably the vast majority of you who are tuning into this video. My guess is that a lot of you have done many, many rounds of rifaximin. I mean, I've worked with patients who have done 10 rounds of rifaximin before seeing me. So this is definitely not followed. This is not standard of care right now, as they would say. Granted, this is a 9-year-old paper, so some things have changed since then. But it's interesting that even this far back, they were saying you should really just use it once and it should be a short run. Now let's look at some papers that look very favorably toward rifaximin. Eubiotic Properties of rifaximin. So the idea for whenever you see EU in front of something, it's usually like inducing homeostasis or inducing like good function or the best function. It's a good thing when you see use something. So eubiotic. Disruption of Traditional Concepts in Gut Microbiota Modulation. So this is a 2017 paper, so fairly recent, 5 years old. Jumping down here, this I'm very curious about. And I'll be honest, I didn't get a chance to read the entirety of this paper, although it's on PubMed Central for free, so I should. They actually noted that in animal models, culture studies and metagenomic analysis have demonstrated an increase in Bifidobacterium, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, and Lactobacillus abundance after rifaximin treatment, which is very curious because I think that one of the concerns using antimicrobials or rifaximin too much is that you could not only build up a resistance to it, which we're going to cover shortly, but you're potentially going to wipe out some good bacteria. And at least this one paper, granted it's an animal model, and then they take the bacteria from the stool and they culture it. So that's also going to skew the results a bit. But this paper mentioned an increase in those 3 beneficial types of bacteria. So very interesting. Then they come down here and they say, antibiotics are therefore modulators of the symbiotic relationship between the host and the gut microbiota. Specific antibiotics, such as rifaximin, can also induce eubiotic changes in the intestinal ecosystem. This additional property may represent a therapeutic advantage in specific clinical settings. So we have at least one paper where they're saying, hey, rifaximin might actually have other properties beyond just the killing of the microbes that we think about in example for SIBO. So interesting to think about. I don't know how much I believe that, to be honest, but maybe that's my hippy-dippy bias kind of getting to me because I tend to favor not using antibiotics unless you absolutely have to. Here's another paper. Rifaximin decreases virulence of Crohn's disease-associated E. coli and epithelial inflammatory response. So this kind of goes back to the idea, similar to this previous paper, where they said, hey, it might not just be antibiotic. You might not just be killing stuff with rifaximin. You might actually be somehow nurturing or favoring the survival of good bacteria. Similarly, in this paper, they said, hey, they're acknowledging rifaximin doesn't just do stuff to the microbes. It actually seems to have an anti-inflammatory effect on the intestinal epithelium. The epithelium is just the barrier, the gut barrier. So when we talk about leaky gut, we're talking about that epithelial barrier. So an anti-inflammatory effect on that epithelial barrier would be a really great thing. So down here they said rifaximin improves symptoms of mild to moderate Crohn's disease. It's unclear if this outcome is due to the effect on bacteria or intestinal epithelial inflammatory responses. Then they came down here and they said rifaximin reduced adhesion, invasion, virulence gene expression, and motility of Crohn's disease-associated E. coli in a manner that was independent of its antimicrobial effect. So it appears that it's also altering the function of the E. coli, which is pretty wicked cool. And to kind of bring this back around to the people who have SIBO or IBS, keep in mind that a fairly high number, I think 30-ish% if I remember correctly, of people with inflammatory bowel disease also have SIBO. So it's possible that some of the benefit that they're seeing here is because the rifaximin is treating the SIBO that they may or may not have been diagnosed with. The other thing to keep in mind is that when they do aspirate studies of SIBO, they actually suck out the juice from the intestines and they put it on a petri dish and they see what grows. The 2 bacteria that are most associated with the overgrowth in SIBO, the O in the SIBO, is E. coli and Klebsiella. So this paper, for all that it's not SIBO or IBS specific, could actually make some sense in the sense that E. coli associated with Crohn's disease is also associated with SIBO and IBS, and that seems to be the principal overgrowth in SIBO, the O in SIBO, if you will. So keep that in mind. I think that there actually is a lot of overlap between SIBO and this particular paper. Then they said, furthermore, rifaximin reduced IL-8 secretion from, don't know how to pronounce that, X receptor expressing T84 colonic epithelial cells. IL-8 it's interleukin 8. It's a cytokine. It's an inflammatory mediator that the immune system makes. So it's like a signaling molecule for the immune system. And it looks like rifaximin decreased that in the colon epithelial cells. Now, that does make me think, though, for what it's worth, you know how everybody talks about, oh, rifaximin doesn't really make it down to the colon, so you're okie dokie. You don't have to worry about anything making down to the colon. Is that accurate? Because we have a paper here saying that there was a change in the colonic epithelial cells. So apparently enough of the rifaximin makes it down south to the colon that it's doing something in the colon. So I don't know if we can fully believe that old notion of like, it doesn't make it to the colon anyway, so you're good, you're fine, you're totally fine. Because we have at least this one paper documenting that maybe a little bit of it does get to the colon. Now marching on, here's a 2017 paper, rifaximin-resistant Clostridium difficile strains isolated from symptomatic patients. This one, they looked at 276 patients with C. diff, and they isolated some of the bacteria from that, and they found that 32% of the C. diff infections were caused by rifaximin-resistant strains. This is going to come up in another video later where we talk about the risk of getting C. diff with rifaximin. It's not a 0% risk. Let's just leave it at that. It does happen. It's not super common, but it does happen. So we do need to be cautious with that when we're potentially getting rifaximin for SIBO or IBS or Crohn's disease. So it looks like a fair whack of the C. diff infections that they saw in the 300 or so patients were resistant to rifaximin. Then, this is a 2020 paper, detection of high-level rifaximin resistance in enteric bacteria by Agar Screen. So again, this is 2020, this is pretty new. And if we scroll down to the conclusions, agar, for those of you who are not microbiology geeks, agar is just the stuff that they put in the petri dish that acts as food for the bacteria. So when you're trying to grow bacteria on a petri dish, they'll put down agar, and that's like the food, that's the medium that the bacteria can adhere to and munch on to favor their growth. So that's what agar is. The conclusions. Our Agar Screen test has the potential to detect high-level rifaximin-resistant Enterobacteriales. Such strains remain rare among extended-spectrum beta-lactamase positive enteric bacteria, but may emerge amongst patients receiving rifaximin for the prevention of hepatic encephalopathy, that was way harder than it should have been, and spontaneous bacterial periodontitis, or among patients receiving rifaximin for other indications. So they're saying that these Enterobacteriales species, which, by the way, remember what I said, E. coli, Klebsiella, those are the bad guys for SIBO, they belong to this group. So it's proteobacteria, then gamma proteobacteria, and then Enterobacteriales is underneath that, and then the famous ones that we know about like Klebsiella, E. coli, Morganella, Citrobacter, they all belong in that little umbrella. So you can kind of translate that loosely to the bacteria that make up SIBO and a lot of the dysbiosis that we see. So they're saying right now, as of 2020, they're saying that amongst their patients with hepatic encephalopathy, that the strains are rarely resistant to rifaximin, but it can happen, and that they're probably going to be more common if we overuse the rifaximin, right? That's the same thing we've heard with every other antibiotic, right? Oh, you overuse penicillin, and then a bunch of stuff winds up becoming resistant to penicillin. Or, methicillin, whatever it might be. The more you use an antibiotic, the more you run the risk of developing or resistance to that antibiotic on the microbial level. So that's, I think, a very real risk. Two more. This is a 2013 paper, rifaximin resistance in Escherichia coli associated with inflammatory bowel disease. And coming down here, again, they say that there is, that they took 62 strains of E. coli isolated from the ileum in 50 patients with Crohn's disease or colitis. So the ileum is just the very last part of the small intestine, for those of you who didn't know that. They said resistance, let's see, hold on, I lost my place here. Resistance was present in 12 of the 48 IBD-associated ileal E. coli strains. Resistance correlated with prior rifaximin treatment, but not with the presence of ileal inflammation or E. coli phylogroup. So what they're saying again is that the more you use rifaximin, the more likely we're going to start developing strains of E. coli or C. diff or maybe other species that are becoming resistant to rifaximin. So it's not that this doesn't happen. It might be less common and it might be a slower process than developing antibiotic resistance against something like penicillin or doxycycline, but it can and does happen. And then this is the most recent paper, but this was the most surprising and juicy in my opinion. This was September 2021, so fairly recent. Rifaximin use favored mycofungin-resistant Candida species infection in recipients of allogeneic hematopoietic cell transplantation. So what they're looking at is basically they're trying to look at things that are involved with graft versus host disease. So when you get a transplant, you get new tissue from another human, your immune system normally would attack that because it's not part of you. But the whole point of getting a transplant is to keep the transplant. So they're trying to research that. And graft versus host disease is one of the things that can happen. So these are in people who are getting stem cell transplantation, presumably because they might have a bone marrow cancer or multiple myeloma, something like that. And coming down here, they said, let's see, they looked at data from 118 consecutive transplants. Basically, they were looking at using rifaximin prophylactically to reduce bacterial infections in these patients. And they said, lost my place again, while instances of neutropenic fever, documented bacterial infections, and graft versus host disease were similar in the two groups, we found an increased frequency in invasive candidiasis and clinically relevant Candida species infection in rifaximin-treated patients. 5 patients versus 1, or 25% of the rifaximin-treated cohort versus only 1% in the placebo group. That is a huge difference. 25% of the cohort versus 1%? 3 rifaximin-treated patients experienced life-threatening candidemia. Rifaximin was the only factor that increased the risk of Candida species infections. Rifaximin could have contributed to microbiome disruption, which favored an outbreak of life-threatening Candida infections. This important complication forced us to halt its use. So, guys, remember, small intestinal fungal overgrowth or Candida overgrowth is a thing, right? We think that it's somewhere between 25 and 40% of people who have SIBO. Then you look at least this one paper and it's making you think, gosh, what if the rifaximin makes the Candida more virulent or more active, or by killing off the good bacteria potentially, or killing off the bacteria period, maybe we're creating space for the Candida to come out and play. And that's something, again, that happens with antibiotics. This shouldn't be a surprise in the sense that, like, if you take a whole bunch of doxycycline or a Z-Pak or penicillin or any other antibiotic, most people, especially women, know that there's a likelihood that you're going to create some space for Candida to come out and play and bloom. And then, boom, you get a Candida infection, whether it's vaginally or in the gut, or if it's oral thrush. Antibiotics, killing bacteria, tend to make a playground for Candida to come out and haunt you. And it looks like rifaximin is not immune. Now, I will point out, because I don't want to freak everybody out on this YouTube video, when they said that 3 of the patients had life-threatening Candida infections, keep in mind, like I said, these were people who had stem cell transplantation, which presumably was because they probably have bone marrow cancer, something like multiple myeloma. These were probably people who were already immunocompromised and sick and quite inflamed. So I do not think that rifaximin use in like the average SIBO patient or the average IBS or IBD patient would cause this specifically to happen. But I still think, even if it's not a life-threatening case of Candida, you don't want to treat the SIBO, air quotes with that a little bit, but you don't want to treat the SIBO with rifaximin and then wind up with small intestinal fungal overgrowth, and then you're scratching your head, what the heck happened? And this actually brings me to my other point. So remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that there's actually two types of resistance that you can have against rifaximin. There's the microbial resistance that we think about with any antibiotic. And we've shown that that probably is something that can happen, whether people like Dr. Pimentel and the makers of rifaximin want you to know about that or think about that, up for grabs. But it can happen, and it's probably going to be more common the more rifaximin is overused in the populations with IBS and SIBO and IBD. But what about cases where it doesn't seem like the bacteria develop resistance, but it's the person who develops a resistance? So I'll paint the picture this way. From your perspective, symptomatically, say there's two people with SIBO. They both go and get rifaximin, and then they both end up getting treated with rifaximin a few more times after that. Person A gets rifaximin the one time, they feel great, and then they get off of the rifaximin, and the symptoms come back. So they get rifaximin again, and they feel great, and then they go off of it, and then, it comes back. And then they go on it again, and they feel great. And this keeps happening, where the person's almost like, man, if only I stayed on rifaximin for the rest of my life, I would be good, right? Like, there are people like that and that's, I think, where it's so tempting to get into that cycle of just repeatedly using the antibiotic because they feel great when they're on it. That's a different story than the person over here where they're like, yeah, I did rifaximin and it was pretty good. Like, I felt good. I felt human again for the 2 weeks or the 3 weeks or whatever it was. And then gradually the symptoms kind of came back. So I did rifaximin again and it was okay. Like, it wasn't as good as the first time, but I definitely felt better than my baseline. So I felt pretty good. And then, the symptoms came back again. So I took rifaximin again. And this time it barely did anything. It was really disappointing. And then, you went off of it. And then you're like, well, all right, what the heck? I'll try it one more time. And then the rifaximin seems to do nothing. That's what we would call clinical resistance as opposed to microbial resistance. Two different things, right? There's a little bit more to unpack with that first scenario. If you want me to go through that in a specific video, let me know in the comments down below, because I won't flesh it out here. But the person where they always feel great when they're on rifaximin, and then it's just like, man, if only I could stay on it the rest of my life. That's actually a totally different kind of world for what it's worth. But I'm painting this picture of the person who feels good and then kind of okay and then barely anything and then nothing at all. That is what we would call clinical resistance. And in my opinion, there's a couple of things that go into that. I'll actually link, I think it was a Facebook Live video that Dr. Pimentel did a while back. I'll put it in the first comment in the description and the tag so you know what time to line it up with. But he talked about this a little bit not that long ago in the Facebook Live. But basically, it's where the person's body is not responsive to rifaximin anymore, and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with microbial resistance. When I hear this story, I'm thinking, okay, so you had a genuine overgrowth of the bad guys, and the rifaximin took it down a couple pegs. Great. But then you felt crappy again, not necessarily because the overgrowth was back, not because the Klebsiella, E. coli, whatever, had come back, but maybe now you were struggling with candida or a lack of good bacteria, or maybe your nutrition isn't adequate and your body is in starvation, fight, or flight mode. Maybe you have some motility impairment. Maybe you have some hormone involvement or thyroid dysfunction, or you're iron deficient, or you have low stomach acid. That's where you start chewing on, okay, the moment in time where the bacteria was really overgrown and the O in the SIBO was a much bigger deal, the rifaximin worked great. So then you took down the bad bacteria, you took them down a peg, and then you were still left feeling crappy, or the crappiness came back, one or the other. So you tried rifaximin again, but now it's having limited benefit because the overgrowth of bad stuff is not the biggest thing you have to tackle anymore, right? And that's something too, I've noticed this with myself as well as patients, is that we tend to forget that we are moving, dynamic, changing creatures. Literally nothing is the same about you today compared to the you of a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. But we tend to think of it that way, right? Like, oh, this is how I lost weight 5 years ago, so I'm going to do it that way again. That might not not work. Your physiology, your anatomy, your microbiome, your brain, your hormones, they're all different now. So, you know, if you took Rifaximin 2 years ago and it was great, and then you took it today and nothing happened, well, you're actually a totally different person than you were 2 years ago. So I think that's a piece of it too, is like something else changed. Or you could almost think of it like a pie chart. Like at the beginning of your pie chart, the biggest chunk of the pie, like this much of the pie, was the overgrowth of the bad stuff, right? That was the biggest single contributing factor to your symptoms. And then you knocked that out with Rifaximin, and then you felt pretty good. But then you're still left with, you know, 2/3 of a pie chart. And now the thing that makes up your symptoms has just shifted a bit. And now maybe the biggest piece of your pie is dysmotility or iron deficiency or thyroid inadequacy. You have to start looking at those other things. If you find that you're getting limited usefulness out of subsequent doses of Rifaximin, it probably means that killing stuff is not the biggest thing you need to do right now. But guys, as always, I hope that this video was helpful. I hope I didn't freak you guys out with the Candida paper too much, but I want to paint this picture of the risk and benefit. I mean, I've had patients use Rifaximin before. It can be really, really helpful. And honestly, sometimes it works better and it can get that instant gratification effect with Rifaximin a little bit quicker than you can with herbals. So I don't question why you would want to use this as a tool, but just know that it is risky and it is going to yield less benefit the more you use it. So ideally, the way you want to use Rifaximin is you want to really get the holistic kind of stuff figured out. You want to evaluate for the root causes and the inflammatory things, the things that we talk about a lot on the IBS Freedom podcast, the things I talk about in this channel or in FODMAP Freedom. You want to get those ducks in a row, so to speak, so that your body is reasonably well balanced. And then you can use antimicrobials. You can use something like Rifaximin or the herbals to kind of take that down a notch. And then you're left with a body that's reasonably able to function. And honestly, this is how I structure FODMAP Freedom. We don't get to antimicrobials at all until week 6. So there's a reason for that. I want my students to set the foundations for good, healthy digestion and good motility and good vagal tone in the first month and a half of FODMAP Freedom. And then we can think about layering in antimicrobials, and then we can get to the fancier stuff like detoxification, probiotics, prebiotics, hormones, that sort of stuff. But I want to set the foundation first before we ever have a conversation about antimicrobials and, in this case, antibiotics. So there's a rhyme and a reason to it, and I hope that that helps you in your healing journey. Let me know below, like I said, if you want me to do a video about like the different scenarios where like you take an antibiotic and it feels great every time versus limited returns versus you have a side effect, I'd be happy to do that and put that in my recording schedule. I just need to know that you guys would actually watch it. And let me know what your experience has been with Rifaximin. Have you taken it? If so, how many times have you taken it? Did you feel like it was helpful for your SIBO symptoms or your IBD symptoms? Were you in that category of person who's taken it 3 times and every single time it's amazing? Or have you taken it 3 times and it's limited or diminishing returns each time you take it? I would love to hear from you in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for everything, for commenting, for subscribing. I appreciate each and every one of you. And I will see you in the next video where we talk about the risk of C. diff infection from taking Rifaximin. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.